this session is about choosing the medical school that's right for you. Obviously, there's a lot of medical schools in the UK, and depending on the program, it might be better to choose one medical school over another and to strategically plan your application. So we'll be having this talk till 2:20, where after the talk you can ask any questions that you have on the chat, and at the end of the talk Professor Wilson will be kindly answering all your questions. To you, Professor Wilson. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ariana. First of all, can I just check everybody can hear me, because I'm getting old and my voice is getting quite croaky. So hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, thanks.
I can hear you.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so as Ariana said, there is a lot of choice out there now, and my job really over the next few minutes is to chat with you about what your options are and how to best strategically think about what medical school you want to apply to. And what I usually start by saying is that there has been a considerable increase in the number of medical school places, and sadly up until this year, that coincided with, as you can see, the blue line on that graph on the left. You can see the number of 18-year-olds in the population in the UK has been steadily declining. So up until this point, you may argue, well, it's really been a brilliant time to be applying to medicine, because there's been a lot more choice, more medical schools, more medical school places, and against a population of falling numbers. But I was listening to UCAS, the universities and colleges admissions people, the other day, and that's where I got some of this data from, have revealed that for the first time since 2015, the 18-year-old population in 2021 will be growing. And this last application round that closed on the 15th of October, it's one of these deadline days. It's called early applications, and you have to do this for medicine, dentistry, veterinary, and certain other subjects. You can see that there's been a significant increase in the number of applicants to medicine. Right, so the key here is to realize that up until very recently, there has never been a better time to apply to medicine. And perhaps now it's going to get a little tougher, but I don't want to dissuade you, and I think there has been, as you can see from the graph, the red line, the number of applicants for medicine has been steadily increasing over the last 5 or 6 years. The thing to realize is that that graph also hides the fact that there is quite a number now of so-called reapplicants, people who didn't get selected at the first attempt and then have reapplied. And therefore increasing numbers of applicants are reapplying and being successful the second time round. So it's important not to get disheartened. As I said, this is a changing picture, and it will continue to change as the population demographic moves up and down. So bear in mind that it is really important that you give yourself the opportunity to apply if you think you're good enough. The other thing to simply say is this, that medical schools have had historically a bit of a par chance for people from a particular background, people that weren't first in family going to university, weren't people whose mum and dad were relatively lived in a fairly poor area, or in an area that wasn't highly supported by good schools and things like that. So we're increasingly putting our efforts into recruiting a more representative distribution of people from the UK to come into medical school, because after all, they're going to be serving a population of patients that you want to be of the same background, or at least you want the students to be of the same background, and ultimately the doctors to be of the same background as the patients, and not just from one particular band. Okay, so that's the sort of good and bad news, but we'll move on. As I said, there has been an increased number of medical schools. Some years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago now, the government at the time decided that we needed to increase the number of medical school places, and we have now seen that coming to fruition, and we have 41 medical schools, depending on how you count them. Some of them are only in their first year of the new courses they created. Universities like Sunderland and various others. There is a private one. There are some that are only for postgraduates, i.e. people who have done a first degree and need to, and you have to have done a first degree to get into their courses, and they're usually so-called graduate entry courses. So that's the distribution. So we know you have a choice, and I think medical schools increasingly are aware of this choice factor and make more effort, I think, to recruit students to them. So these are some of the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about where you want to study. On your UCAS form, you will have 5 options. One of them is a non-medical option. You have to really select 4 medical schools. So it's really important you research these fairly thoroughly. Some of the things, and I don't want to rehearse them all, but you know, I work in a city university, and it's a capital city. It has a lot of benefits from being such, but there are some, like if you went to Lancaster, it's a campus university, and it's out in part of rural Lancashire and has lovely surroundings, things like that. So you want to think about whether or not that would suit you. You know, in terms of whether you would like to be in a rural environment or slightly remote from a city, or in a city. The sizes are important in medical schools. Some of the new ones are really quite small. They're obviously, I mentioned Lancaster, they've just increased their number from, in this last round, from 75 to 150. In Cardiff, we're looking usually at about 300 first-year students coming into the course. And therefore, it's important to understand that if you've got a large medical school, you know, there's a risk that you could be a bit anonymous, but there is also an increased chance that you will find like-minded people of your background in the group that come into the medical school with you. The other thing is distance, and we're looking at the moment, and I have to travel for my sins to various medical schools because I examine in them, and some of the travel can be quite arduous. Currently, I have to travel pretty much the length of Britain to get to one of them. Of course, lockdown prevents all that at the moment, but it is a challenge, and therefore you need to think very hard about how easily accessible home is to the medical school that you're thinking about choosing. The other thing is that there are lots of ranking tables out there, many of which I have very serious doubts about the way that they come up with these rankings, but nonetheless, people look at them and make some judgment on what they see. And these are often based upon things like the research reputation of the university and the medical school, and often about the teaching now, that medical schools are, like all universities, have now been awarded either a gold, silver or bronze ranking, if you like, in terms of teaching. So that might be something you want to consider. There are different types of courses, and I don't want to rehearse all of these because I'm sure there are others around here. Over the 40 years almost of teaching medical students, I've pretty much experienced all of them. The worst one is what I'm doing now, and that is essentially lecturing somebody until their eyes bleed, which is not really much fun for either side. And it's even more difficult when you're doing it remotely, as I am now. But that is changing. We are not seeing as many, and gradually the course natures have changed over the last 10 or 15 years. And you will hear words like CBL or PBL or integrated and these kind of things. And what that means is the courses have changed from ones that have been traditionally separated into what's called a preclinical 2 years and then a 3 years clinical period. And that's still true in certain universities. If you go to Cambridge, that's pretty much the type of course you will find in Cambridge. But the majority of other medical schools have moved to a more integrated approach, and that's really to try and get students to appreciate what they're learning in the context of patients. And I don't really think it's appropriate for me just to advocate about Cardiff, but one of the things we did, I was part of it about 7 or 8 years ago, is we changed the curriculum such that what we did was we moved a lot of the formal teaching reduced it. Still quite a lot of teaching goes on, but it's done in a way that's different from lecturing people. And one of the ways to do that is to get people into groups, into case groups as we call them, and they learn themselves, and I, as a facilitator, will spend time with 10 weeks discussing what they've come up with, how it links with what they've seen in terms of patients, because they will have been out and seen patients with different conditions that relate to the material they're learning, and also perhaps to the clinical skills they may be learning at the same time. So it's really important to think about the fact that the course type will depend upon, or what you choose will depend upon how best you learn. And I'm a very visual learner, and I know that if I don't have visual stimulus and relevance to what I'm learning from a book applied into the patient context or whatever I'm learning, it's really, it's very difficult for me to maintain interest and maintain enthusiasm for that teaching. I won't dwell on accommodation. What I will say, and I'll come back to accommodation in a minute, it's very varied, and it's from sort of very exclusive with almost an ensuite facility right the way through to a shared accommodation in some rather grim house with a bunch of mates. So and the cost varies accordingly. Student union facilities, now, again, I don't want to talk about Cardiff, but many medical schools and universities have realised that they need to improve the facilities for students, and one of the ways of doing that is to improve student union, and we're just massive amount of money on a student lifeguarding in Cardiff as an attempt to make sure that we are catering for our students in the appropriate way. Okay, there's a couple of questions that have popped up on the way through, and can I apply to the advice he's giving? Well, that's very nice. To non-medical schools. Yeah, I think that's true. You can apply to dentistry, nursing, all the rest of it. Secondly, somebody's asked, how early should we start looking at universities? Well, that's a really good question. That's from Darren, and I think the answer to that is the sooner the better. I'm presuming that the audience of, what do we got here, about 120, 130 people, most of you will probably be year 12, probably in that year of preparing yourselves to go and apply next October to medical school. But there's nothing to stop you starting earlier, and I often commend students who start earlier, because the earlier you start, the better understanding you have of what's ahead of you. So I hope, Darren, that answers your question. Okay. Transport links, I've kind of applied about that. And the other thing is recommendations. One of the things that works well is to listen to what other students tell you. If they're medical students in a particular university, they often have outreach programs where you can actually chat to them ahead of time and say, well, tell me what you think's good about Birmingham, what you think's good about Leeds. And that will give you a good feel for the good and bad of the potential medical schools that you're looking at. I've then asterisked this word visit, and I can't, in these days of lockdown, I know we're in Wales, we're just coming to the end of a 2-week lockdown, and you're about to enter a 4-week one. And so therefore the option to go and visit is pretty limited. However, universities and medical schools generally are much more aware of this now, and they will provide online, takes a bit of searching sometimes, but virtual tours. Now, obviously they're going to show you the best of everything, because that's what they're into these days, but there's no doubt that you can get a reasonable feel of what the place feels like, even just by doing virtual tours and such like. So try, if and when the opportunity arises, to visit the medical school of your choice or your choices. I did this with my lad. He's 2 years ago was applying, and we travelled around and we looked, and it was interesting. He went to one particular, not a med school, it's just a university, but very quickly ruled it out because it was just the wrong feel. Now, I'm not naive. This all costs money, travelling around and judging things. So do as much as you can online. Select perhaps the 4 or 5 that you're thinking about, and then perhaps of those, visit the 2 or 3 that you really think are your shortlist. So that's important. One of the things I often ask students is, do you know what the course length is? And it's interesting, most say, well, it's 5 years, Dave. And you go, yeah, well, that's true. but it could be 6. So if you applied now to Edinburgh this forthcoming year, your course would be a 6-year course because they just moved to an intercalated year, i.e. a year where you study science or something related to your course, get an extra degree on the way through, and that then takes it to a 6-year. UCL, University College London, has had that style of course for forever, since 2000, and there are others in between that. So it's really important because consequently, the most important thing about this is how you're going to fund and sustain yourself over the 5 or 6 years. So the key thing there that I said that you really need to make a note of is probably the word intercalated degree. Cardiff, for example, it's still an option. And about a third to a half of our year group take at the end of 3rd year or at the end of 4th year the opportunity to study a degree, an extra degree if you like, en route to getting their medical degree. It takes 1 year, so the course then becomes, rather than a 5-year course, it becomes 6 years. You need to consider entry requirements, and I'll come back to this in a little while because I worry often, oh, someone's just asked, is Oxbridge the best? Well, no. I would say it suits a certain type. I can tell you my niece went to Cambridge and found it quite difficult. She was a very bright kid, best in the area that she came from, but found it difficult to integrate things. Oh, it's good someone's just been looking at the Edinburgh course. So I would, there's someone asked about schools in other countries, and I'd be very cautious about that. I'm only going to talk about the medical schools in the UK. The worry for me is that students apply because sometimes it's easier to get in to medical schools in Europe, but it's very difficult to come back into the UK having qualified. Not always difficult, but can sometimes. And I imagine with Brexit, it's going to get tougher. Okay, so the entry requirements are quite varied. I'll give you an example. You can do the UCAT, which is now, I think, most medical schools ask for it. About, of the 40, I suspect probably about 2/3 of them ask for UCAT. There is about 7 or so that ask for something called BMAT. Cardiff, there are variations of this. For example, Cardiff, where I come from, we ask that you do UCAT, but we don't use it currently as a way of thresholding students that we then want to interview. We base our evaluation on GCSEs. The other thing, so I'll come back to entry requirements because it's a fairly thorny one, and there's a really good resource that I'll point you towards that really tells you all you need in one doc, in one site, and it's really accurate and pretty much all you need to know in one place. I'll come back to that. Work experience, again, I'll come back to, but it's difficult in this current climate to get work experience. And again, I'll come back to this in terms of what universities and medical schools have done to try and circumvent, get round the problem of students thinking they need to do work experience, but how can they do it in times of the pandemic? There are different interview types. Now, again, we are having to deal with the problems of the pandemic, and we're moving, for example, here in Cardiff, we are moving our face-to-face interviews, which were multiple mini interviews. We're moving that online, and that's generally true for a lot of other medical schools. But some are moving back to what are called panel interviews, where you have one interviewee, one interview, and usually about three interviewers, and that's the measure of it. Whereas in Cardiff and multiple mini interviews, there's multiple people interviewing you, so there's more chance of not bombing it, if you like, if you just get it wrong with the 3 in the interview that you happen to be. Okay, so there's some questions here that are a bit sort of, does GCSEs make or break whether you can go to med? I'll come back to that, and elsewhere in the world, and I'll come back to that. Finally, I'll just, on this particular slide, I'll think is, how does it feel? Does it feel right for you? You all know what works best for you. I, as an individual, know what skill set I have in my learning strategies, and therefore it's really important that you look into this and make sure that the medical schools that you're thinking about feel right for you. So I've kind of covered this. You know, as I said, there's a traditional, there's the integrated, there's the case-based, PBL, and you will struggle in some respects to find clear delineations between some of these. What is a case-based course? How about what's the difference between that and a problem-based course? Well, I can tell you, kids coming to Cardiff can tell you about, students currently in the course will be more than happy to tell you about the case-based experience, and people in Manchester who runs a PBL course, or indeed Plymouth, will be able to tell you the benefits of their course. So it's important you go in. Integrated is what a lot of medical schools have moved to now, and really that's the biggest difference between traditional and the other courses. Integrated means they want you to experience patient care at the earliest opportunity, because without it, I think it's very difficult to see the relevance of the material that's being taught. You know, all science without some relevance to the patient is very hard to learn. So I said I'd give you a source, and this is it. And if the only thing you recall from this time that I spent talking to you, perhaps it's the most important. There are undoubtedly lots of people out there that will try to exploit applicants to medicine, and it grieves me enormously that that happens. This is a free resource. It is constructed by the medical schools themselves. So I provide information. I'm part of the Selection Alliance for the Medical Schools Council, and we provide this information with the intent that it is accessible to all. And I think it's really important that you try to access this material because it is reliable. It's not going to try and sell you something else. It will say, this is what you need. Here's some talking heads, or here's a video, here's an info sheet, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So please, as I say, note down or screenshot that URL. That's actually the PDF of the entry requirements, which is the list of every medical course in the UK and their entry requirements. Now that's so-called A100 courses, that's the traditional, come in at 18 and go through, or the GEM, the graduate entry courses, they're all listed. If you need a foundation year, there's a couple of those and they're listed. And then there's the so-called gateway courses. And these are designed to try and broaden widening access into medical schools. So please try and use this resource. There's lots of stuff there, and I'll come back to some of this stuff. Pretty much what I just said, it's accurate, it's free, and it's endorsed by all the medical schools. I can't emphasize that enough. So it's a brilliant resource, so please use it. And this is the only complaint I had about it. And what's interesting, I'm old and I moan, and I'm not very techy, as some of the chat earlier made evident. But the fact is that what we need to do is make what we provide to students who are thinking of applying to medicine accessible. And even with my limited abilities, I thought that the Medical Schools Council could do better. And apparently in January, they're going to relaunch this site with it being better for people like you to access it, because it is important. It's no good saying, oh, we got this resource, but it takes forever to find the information. So if you go to the tab, and what I've done is circled the Studying Medicine one. As you go, it's the resources. Then you go to the Medical Schools Council. This is the site. You go to Studying Medicine. There's some drop-down menus. And the first one that you might want to look at is the resources for teachers and applicants. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it needs to be for teachers. Some of you will be fortunate enough to have teachers that are in the know on how to get their students to apply to medical school. Others will not. So my first and foremost concern is that this should be material and resources for applicants. So when you hit that tab, the resources for teacher and applicants, and bear in mind that most of this is for applicants, you find some really useful stuff. And I don't intend that you read this. This is just purely for illustration. These are the so-called info sheets. There's 17 of them. And they look a bit dense, but it's kind of funny. These are essentially the two sides of page that explain what I'm trying to explain in this talk to you this afternoon. It's the differences between medical schools. And it says there in the first thing, did you know the number of places of each medical schools is limited by the government? Absolutely. we don't randomly say, oh, we'll only have 300. It's what Welsh government, because we're a Welsh medical school, tell us we're allowed to take. We can only take 25 overseas students because the government say that we can only have 7.5% of our intake to be from international places. The most important thing of these, you can read it, but look at the thing at the very end, because this is what I think is really useful. They have this little bit called test yourself. And one of the things that's useful, these are not always applicable because some of you are used to whether you like working in small groups, whether you like engaging directly with people, all those kind of questions. But it's a good thing to think about because these will dictate, as I said earlier, whether or not it's a course that would suit you. So that's the info sheets. And I say there's 17 of them, ranging from differences between medical schools. And the next one, I think, is what medicine's all about. And again, there's two sides. Test yourself at the end there. List all the sources of information you can think of. Work out which are the 3 most important sources of information from this list. Decide how you will access those sources of information. So try and understand what medicine is about. I've been in this job many, many years, and it breaks my heart sometimes when, as I was some years ago, I was responsible for the early years of the medical course, and students would wander in and say, actually, Dave, I don't really want to do medicine. And you go, what? You've done all this, you've made all this effort to get into medical school. So what happened? Tell me why you not want to do it? Well, you know, it's my mum and my dad, or it was my teachers. They said I was a bright kid, so they wanted to encourage me to go into medicine, blah, blah. I really wanted to be an English teacher. So my job then was to actually try and find a course within the university that would suit them. So it's really important that you understand medicine. And there's another reason that I'll briefly come back to about why you need to understand the career that you're going to enter into once you've gone to medical school. This is another sheet, and again, I don't want to overemphasize these things, but this is just the UCAT. I said about 2/3 of medical schools now use UCAT as a way of selecting students for interview. And what they want you to do there is go and look at the UCAT website. There is loads and loads and loads of free material and practice questions there and video information. You don't need to pay other people to go and get this sort of practice. If you do the timed practices on this, it says, did you know the best preparation is to complete the free practice papers under exam conditions? That's it. So that's where you should start. The other thing the Medical Schools Council have done over the recent years and recent times is, and they're just updating this continuously almost, is they've now, they've now done sort of little info shorts, and these are just like video clips, talking heads of people a bit like me whose job is to organise the selection of applicants for the entrance into the medical school. First of all, to interview them and then to make them offers. And these are very, very clever, short video clips of people talking about their admissions processes or other things. And there's a whole variety of these little info shorts, these little video clips, YouTube clips that and here's one. So this is someone I know, she's in Liverpool, Fiona Watson, Dr. Fiona Watson up in Liverpool. And she talks about what makes a good doctor, combined with other people that I know well from the Selection Alliance, psychiatrists and various other people, all involved in selecting medical students for medical entry. And they talk to you about what makes a good doctor. And these are useful things to go and listen to, or at least have the opportunity to listen to. Okay, I think I've done enough of a plug for the Medical Schools Council material, and as I say, they're updating it in January, so hopefully it'll be even more accessible than it currently is. So the question is, I've seen on the chat the people asking about specific GCSEs and all the rest of it. Well, they really look at two things. One is what's called your cognitive ability, and that is what your brain is able to do. Okay, so they measure that by academic qualifications largely. It may be UCAT, it may be BMAT, it may be GCSEs. It all ultimately comes down to A levels and getting sufficient grades at A level in specific subjects often. But the other thing that they look for is your non-cognitive skills and abilities. It's your personality in some measure. It's how, as I suggested earlier, how you work with others, how observant you are, how forensic you are. how ethically your ethical view of the world works and such like. So it's really important that it's not just about your brains. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. I'm easily distracted, but so there's a question about EPQ. I'll pick it up in a minute. But the fact is that we have, all of you probably have sufficient cognitive ability. What it is about then using that and enhancing your non-cognitive, so that when you combine the two, you are the most selectable for medical school entry. So routes into medicine, this I think deals with some of the questions that have been cropping up. Okay, you can usually apply with GCSEs and or an admissions test. I mentioned UCAT and BMAT, so you could, that's the most common route, that you apply whilst you're doing your A-levels, in your final year of A-levels. The medical schools look at your performance either in the UCAT, BMAT or in your GCSEs. There was a question on the chat, are there specific GCSEs? Yes, many will say there's a minimum, and these will be at a particular grade, and they will be in English, maths, double award science, or triple award if that's the way you've done it, and they will tell you what grade minimum you have to achieve in those. So look out for that, and that's all in this document I showed you earlier in this presentation from the Medical Schools Council. Those are all listed there. So, there's a certain lack of attractiveness of people that are applying at year 13. That's only because there's an uncertainty about how many will actually get the A-levels. So we interview loads, and then we offer loads, and then of that we expect a certain number of those to achieve the grades that we are asking for. So there is another option. You can apply at 13 or year 13, or you can do something I think is even smarter. Is concentrate on your A-levels, get your A-levels, then put your foot to the floor, get your application in for the 15th of October for the following year entry. So in a sense, you're taking a gap year. Now, this doesn't mean you have to travel to some exotic, far-flung country and do wonderful things in that year. You can just work for a year and earn some hard-earned readies for when you go into university. So that's probably, I think, one of the strongest routes into medicine, all things else being equal, because universities and medical schools will love you more because you've already got your A-levels in your back pocket when you're applying. And if you've met the tariff they're asking for, they can get into a dialogue with you much earlier and say, okay, well, we've now chosen you. You can start getting involved with planning to come to the medical school that's now there. So I hope that makes some sense. That doesn't mean to say don't apply with GCSEs and the UCAT and BMAT, but there is a level of uncertainty with the A-levels and in getting the grades you need. Now, just on that one point, I'm often asked, and this is the wit and wisdom of an old fella, one of the things I'm often asked is, Dave, I've been encouraged to do 4 or 5 A-levels, and I just hold my head in my hands and I go, why would you want to do 4 or 5 A-levels? What there is a risk of doing by doing more than 3 is you spread yourself too thin. If you do that, you then might underperform in one of the critical A-levels that are required for you to get into medical school. So my best advice to any of you that are in this position is think good and hard about your coping ability to do 4 A-levels, plus all the other things that you're required to do as an applicant to medicine. And think really hard about whether or not you want to do those additional A-levels. No medical school tariffs extra A-levels. All they ever ask for is 3 A's or above, and that's generally the way of it now. There are some med schools that will ask for slightly less in certain circumstances, and more than happy to discuss that. But the fact is that's pretty much what you've got to get. Is 3 A's. 2 A's and a B could cost you. So if you're doing more than you need, don't risk it, is my strongest advice. The final route into things, if you do not do well in your A-levels, then you have the option of going and doing another degree somewhere else for 3 years and then applying as a graduate entry. And there are a number of medical schools now, and you'll see them listed in, I think there's 17 now, 17 graduate entry medical courses in the UK. So you can go and find out what their requirements are. Okay, so what are we looking for mostly? Well, you know, this is the non-cognitive skills. We want people that are people-focused, and I won't rehearse all those kind of things, but some evidence of this kind of background. Somebody who's caring. I mean, it's really, really important to emphasize the fact that you do have a caring nature, because without that, it's not going to get you off first base. You can think about the work and the experiences you've got from the work that you've done, whether that be part-time retail, restaurant work, bar work, or even in pharmacies and other things. It might be your mum and dad's corner shop. That's fine. Tell us what you've learned from doing that. Tell us your worst customer. Probably some guy like me who discovered that you sold out of whatever it was I wanted, and I'm getting grumpy about it. Talk about your school and college responsibilities, the roles that you've fulfilled within that. My long-time experience, and I hope there's amongst the 169 of you, there may be some Man U supporters. Bruno Fernandes has scored 2, and they're now 2-1 up at Everton. So that just shows you what my life has been. It's been about football. I was a captain of football teams all my life, pretty much. I'm now just the old bagman that still collects the money, washes the kit, that kind of stuff. But it's all a responsibility. And I've been doing that since year dot. And I love it. It's what I do. So think about those responsibilities, things. But don't just tell us. Tell us what you've learned about yourself, because that's the critical ingredient. It's not, oh, I did this. It's, I did this and learned this about myself. And one of the things that I've learned about myself as I've got older is I don't have a problem asking people for money. Many years ago, I used to be it used to break my heart to ask people for the money to, pay whatever it was that week. Nowadays, I'm upfront about it. Yeah, give us your money because I need it, because that's what this is going to cost to buy this pitch for today or whatever. Do you see my point? And I've learned a lot more over the years. I may say over 40 years you'd hope to, but the fact is you can learn that much earlier, and these are real skills. Dealing with difficult subjects, that's effectively what it amounts to. Now reflect on what you learned in this sort of cycle. So what? So tell us what it was, then think about when I found that difficult, now what? I'm going to do it better next time because I'm going to get past myself on this one. Right. There is a lot of money wasted on personal statements. I've just spent some time with a third-year medical student in Cardiff looking at what medical schools tell us they use in terms of personal statements. Now, the general truth is that only about a third of them use it in any device to select for non-cognitive skills for an interview. The rest, the other 2/3, don't ask. You couldn't really pick it out. It's very hard to work out. The problem is that the personal statements as an evidence base of what your skills are is very weak. It tends to be formulaic. Oh, I like doing medicine. I want to do medicine because I was really good at science at school. Or, I was bought a chemistry set when I was 7 and I, blah, blah. And on it goes. It's unverifiable for the most part. Now, one thing I will say there is, if you're going to get an academic referee, and you need an academic referee, not just some person that you did some work experience with, get them to include in their reference anything that they can verify about what you say you've achieved or done in your personal statement. And finally, the biggest problem is that this is corruptible, because at the moment it's very hard to prove who wrote the personal statement, and they're offered commercially. And I've spent some very disheartening hours looking across the spectrum of what's offered, and it is quite disturbing, really, to realise that people are exploiting medical applicants for commercial gain. I said to you about work experience, and this is because of the pandemic, has become a real problem for us. So my advice to you is go and have a look at this document. Embedded within this, there are some brilliant resources. These resources are things like the Royal College of General Practice videos that you can watch. These are real events where they have made it accessible to people like yourself, so you can look at the patient, the doctor interaction, and reflect on what's going on there. What was good about it? What was the doctor not saying? What was the doctor asking? You see what I mean? You can reflect on these things just simply by doing it online. And given the circumstances at the moment, probably the best you can hope for. Now, it may change, and let's hope so. But the fact is, there's some cracking advice on this website explicitly about getting relevant experience. The other thing is that they suggest other sources, and I have to say I'm as bad as anybody else. I'll sit and watch GP behind closed doors and sit going, oh, that was painful, or you know, some of these ER programs, you know, emergency room programs, and I'll sit there going, oh, that looks horrific. Oh, look at what they managed to do there, you know. So it's really important that you look expansively at the opportunities about getting, if you like, okay, it may be vicarious, but it's still work experience. It's work experience by a different means. Okay, so I'm going to try and wrap up fairly quickly. I don't know how much more I've got, but I want to leave some time to deal with some of the questions and some of the issues that have cropped up. So, okay, so if we say at the top of that circle is the application cycle is the 15th of October deadline. Miss that deadline and you will be applying the following year, because most medical schools are extremely hard-nosed about you've got to meet the deadline. We do occasionally, and I just warn you, we do occasionally find referees have been slow in getting the reference bit completed and caused delay. So, you know, just make sure you've got them on board. We then look at these, and we've had getting on for almost 4,000 applications to Cardiff this year, and a team of us are working methodically through these to check on the UCAS form what academic and non-academic qualifications and criteria are being met on these forms. And on the basis of that, we then select for interview. We will make a decision about how many we're going to interview, and we will then make offers to those people for interview. You, in that period, will then prepare for the interview. We have already sent a link to most of the applicants to explain what will be different this year, because I've already explained things by virtue of the pandemic have had to change. So you, as a potential applicant, will need to bear in mind what the interview timetable is all about and how it is you need to prepare. Then we will be running our interviews. Actually, it will be in January this year. That's for Cardiff. I imagine most other med schools will be about the same sort of time, spreading into March. And then on the back of that interview, you will be made an offer. And then you, if you've got an offer, that's great. You can firm it or not. You can use it as your insurance choice if you've had another offer, and on you go. The problem is if you don't get an offer, and that does involve quite a few students. And therefore, the thing to find out is, well, okay, well, if I got interviewed, what was it at the interview that I did poorly at, and what can I do better next time? So crave feedback. At Cardiff generally tries to provide at least some generic feedback about what you did well and what could have been improved. And I have to say, there are some candidates that just need to wake up, that, you know, swearing during an interview isn't very smart. Wearing inappropriate clothes, whatever they may be, is not very smart and could cost you. And as I've said earlier, think about reapplying, because if you get the feedback and think, I know how to deal with that, or next time I'll be a bit smarter, then you reapply for the next deadline. So I hope that's helpful in terms of the cycle of activity. So the interviews themselves are about learning to judge your non-cognitive skills. And they are, you need to research the interview type that they're going to be used by the medical schools. Most, as I say, are now multiple mini interviews. Be self-reflective, learn and think about your skills, your abilities and your interests, and think about vignettes, little instances of, well, what can I tell them about that where I did something really well, or I could have done that much better if I'd have given it a bit more thought. So that reflection is really important. be confident and positive, because anybody who doesn't look confident and doesn't have a positive attitude is not often able to communicate well with the person they're talking to. Try not to over rehearse. It's easy to say, but it's just hard to listen to. If you're an interviewer and you just get somebody who just goes off on one without really having listened to the question, it's very hard to give them a high score. The most important thing, get a good night's sleep, be able to try and stay calm during the process, and please try to follow instructions. I just stuck this slide in because this is what it looks like in Cardiff when it's happening in real terms. You know, you can see that there are people standing up and people sitting down. The interviewers are sitting down. We've got 2 rotations. Everybody sits down on cue. They have a number of minutes to read a question. Then they perform, if you like, answering those questions. The person has an iPad in front of them. They're checking boxes on the iPad and scoring you as you're talking. And the one thing about this is we have 9 stations in that particular configuration. And by the time you've done 9 stations, there's pretty good evaluation of you. The second thing is that if you stuff one up completely, it doesn't cost. I've known students do really poorly in 1 station but have still been offered a place in Cardiff. So it's really critical that you don't panic and just put it behind you. It's all about resilience to some extent. Learn from it, move on. The reason this is important, and the reason I've just stuck it down the bottom here, is what we are doing here is essentially mirroring the clinical assessments that are now used extensively on medical courses. They're called observed structure clinical examination, or OSCE for short. And you will find these are almost the bread and butter assessments now as you go through medical schools. So what you're seeing in the MMI, the multiple mini interviews, are very akin to what you do in OSCEs, because they have a rotation of stations and you get grilled on each of the patient scenarios you have to deal with in the clinical parts of the course. The areas that we interview and quiz on are fairly straightforward. They're pretty much what you'd expect. We look at your communication skills. Now, self-directedness, and I just saw in the chat a load of questions about EPQs, and if you're Welsh, you might be doing the Welsh back, and they have a project bit of it. And the key there is to remember that it doesn't actually add anything in terms of UCAS tariff points or anything extra like that. But what it does do is gives you something to talk about in your ability to be self-directed. And self-directedness for our course is really important, because if you come into a case-based course like ours, you have to be able to go and research stuff. And it's no good saying I found it on Mumsnet or treehuggers.com. You've got to come back with information for the group that is reliable, is well evidenced, and they can believe in. Because if that's going to determine what drug of choice should be used for this particular patient, it can't really be best argued that it's come from Mumsnet or from some other unreliable source. So your EPQ training is that ability to research something and to sift through what is good and not so good evidence to support the arguments that you're making in your project. You need to know about the NHS. It's always changing. Life is always difficult in the NHS at its current time, so you need to understand it. I already alluded to the fact you need to understand a career in medicine and have some insight into what lies ahead of you. You know, there will be questions about your ethics. You know, if so-and-so, if, you know, let's imagine you're a GP and a patient, you know, finds your details and puts in a Facebook friend request, what do you do? You know, I have lots of friend requests, I can tell you, and I ignore all of them pretty much universally. So nobody gets to talk to me through Facebook. So, you know, it's a very important question. Empathy, you know, I talked about caring earlier. You know, pretty much, you've got to care for people. Even in my dotage, up until very recently, I go on a Saturday night once a month and go and give food and drink to the homeless. And there's a lot in Cardiff. And I go down there, and it's quite challenging because half of them are off their face on fish food, as it's called, or some drug, you know, spice and other drugs. And it's kind of hard to be empathetic. But the fact is there is a need. And my token, if you like, effort is to try and help them with that need. Resilience, I've talked about in terms of being able to get back up and do it again. Teamwork, I don't think that needs that much explanation. We often include a couple of numeracy and reasoning stations in Cardiff, simply to make sure that you can logically follow an argument and that you can actually manage some numbers. Because despite the fact that people may have A-level maths, sometimes you give them the simplest maths and they just go to pieces. So it's a useful discipline.
I have to stop you there.
Yep, I've just reached the end. So thanks for your time.
Thank you for sharing so many tips. I wish I knew as a medical student, as an applicant for medicine. So firstly, you've given us a lot of advice. Does this advice apply only for medicine, or does it apply for courses like nursing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, for example, nursing in Cardiff, they use multiple mini interviews. So a lot of what I've said about the interview, I think, the other thing about nursing is that there's lots of different branches, and you really need to understand whether it is truly midwifery you want to do, or mental health arm, or these kind of things. So it's important to do the research in the same way as you would do for medical school, but make sure, and it's even harder perhaps for nursing, because medicine is medicine, whereas nursing has different branches within the nursing course. Do you see my point?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question I think you answered is Cardiff PBL.
It's CBL, and the only difference there, Ariana, is, and to whoever the questions were, is the fact that PBL is a little bit more loose formed. We still provide, within the 2 weeks of a case, we provide lectures, or plenaries as they're called now, practicals, patient interactions. Every week there's patient interactions and clinical skills training that goes alongside it. PBL is a bit more free form. It can be slightly more challenging to try and define what are the learning outcomes. I, as a facilitator, tell the students by the end of the fortnight, this is what you should have learned. And that makes a difference, because it takes away the uncertainty that can exist in certain types of courses of knowing the detail, because that's what gets forced. You as a student will know this, Ariana. It's the amount of detail is the tricky thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Professor Wilson. Another question from a seemingly ambitious participant here. How early should we start looking at universities?
Well, as I said, I think it is mostly about getting started as soon as medicine drops onto your horizon in your mind, because I think the earlier you think about it, the better the chances are you're going to do well in the requisite GCSEs. You then make the right A-level choices. You know, there are very few courses now that are on offer. Cardiff does have one, but students often may do the wrong A-levels, and therefore have to do a 6-year, an extra year, if you like, to do the A-levels. They still come in with the high A-level grades, but they then have to perhaps do this extra year to get perhaps the chemistry or the biology they didn't get because they didn't make the connection early enough.
Yeah, I think it's never too early to start looking. So
no, I don't think it's ever too early.
So I think you already explained some points about this. Is there much difference between the admissions test? So I'm assuming the person in question is referring to BMAT and UKCAT.
Yeah, they're quite different. I think that UCAT is more designed to look at verbal reasoning. It's got various, I think it's 5 or 6 different domains that they explore within the test, whereas BMAT is more science-based and much more academic, I would argue, whereas UCAT, and I would certainly get in touch with UCAT if you've got any questions about the design of the thing. The other thing about UCAT that it does have, and some medical schools will exclude students now, is something called the situational judgment test, or the SJT, which is a component of the test. Now, for the life of me, I can't see the justification of excluding a 17-year-old for failing a situational judgment test, because we learn our ethical and moral compass by emulating people that we work with and learn with. And I think that is very hard to make a judgment call at 17 and say, you know, this person's not suitable. So just beware of that, because I do know there are some med schools that do exclude on the basis of what's called Band 4 SJT of the UCAT. So that's really the difference between UCAT and BMAT.
Yeah.
There was a really good question. Sorry, I just popped past this. Missed. Anyway, maybe you'll pick it up, but I don't know if I can scroll back.
I'm just trying to like go down the list according to what time they posted the question, because there's so many questions and it's impossible to answer all of them. But if you'd like to cover that question first.
Okay, yes, from Ellis a few seconds ago. It said, how would you recommend the best ways to prepare for an interview for medical school? And I think that's a really, really good question, because one of the things that I think you can do is simply look in a mirror and try and talk for 3 minutes on some question that you've pulled off the web, because you can get loads of MMI questions off the web. There's nothing secret about it. So, okay, so you're asked, tell me about why you want to do medicine. Your preparation, if you like, is look somebody in the eye and say, I want to do medicine because, and then rehearse that. The other thing is to video it and look back and say, was I making eye contact? You know, you can do it on your phone, you know, and look and see how convincing or otherwise you look when you're talking to somebody. And the final thing to think about in terms of preparation is get some mates that you trust. Maybe if there are other friends of yours that are thinking of applying to nursing, dentistry, medicine, whatever, and do it with them, because you know you can share the experience with them. They'll tell you what was good, they'll tell you what's bad. You know, stop scratching, Dave, or stop, you know, looking away or looking down, or you know, those are really critical comments. No good just saying, oh, that was lovely, because that doesn't tell you anything. You need to be critical.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Practice makes perfect, really. So, yeah, definitely agree with you there. So we have another question. So this person is concerned. She will be 17 when she's applying to medical school, something that's happened to me as well. Will that affect her chances of getting in?
Okay, for that individual and for those that are that age, it's a problem for us. It's a bizarre legal problem. There was one earlier question about whether the course offers dissection. Now, the problem for us is at age 17, under the eyes of the law, you're still a child. And I can almost see the Daily Mail headlines saying, child allowed to dissect human remains in medical course. You know, you couldn't make it up, but you probably could imagine it. But the reason that medical schools are very prescriptive about what age somebody has to be at point of entry is often to do with the nature of their course. And if they are, as we do in Cardiff, we offer full body dissection from the earliest opportunities, that is the first few weeks of the term, you have to be 18 at the point of entry to our course. Now, it may be that there are some, and you might need to explore this, if the course is a preclinical, clinical one, they may not be so strict about the 17, 18 barrier. But that's the reason why we in Cardiff, and it's a very straightforward, it's nothing we specify, it's just in the eyes of the law, a 17-year-old sadly is still regarded as a child.
So another question, as you said, it's best to visit the campus and the university to get a better idea. How is that going to happen with COVID?
Well, I think, you know, I think there's two things, Ariana, I think, and whoever's asked the question, it's very difficult, there's no doubt. I mean, the number of times that, you know, I'm what's called a blended campus worker, I've got to go in for my test on Monday afternoon, you know, because I've been in contact with, you know, students and things. So it's difficult. I'm not underestimating how difficult it will be. The thing I would suggest you do is go online and look, because there is lots of virtual tours. A lot of med schools now offer outreach programs, whether they just be an opportunity to talk to students on the course, and they may be able to discuss with you what they think about the thing. I don't know that there's much else at the moment I would recommend. Certainly at this current time, you can't travel, but if the situation doesn't change significantly, I would suggest that traveling is unwise. You know, even universities currently are thinking about how they're going to release students out of their universities come Christmas. and that's a bit of a debate at the moment. So I don't underestimate how difficult it is, but let's just assume we get something that will protect people from COVID and the worst successes of it by the new year. I wonder then perhaps we will start to see changes. Just for example, just as from my little world, Cardiff's first face-to-face open day is planned to be next July. So that gives you some measure of the timescale that we're looking at.
I've been getting other questions with regards, this is the last question, because we're running a bit out of time. So with regards to going abroad and studying in other countries and possibly being an international student wanting to travel abroad after studying in the UK, what do you think about that, and what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I think you get opportunities through the medical course to go elsewhere. You know, students go on electives. Some of my students 2 years ago, when I worked on the island of Samos with the poor refugees that have ended up on that island and living in really poor conditions, and they worked over the summer. We've had students go and work in Fongat and in the camps there in France. So I think there's lots of opportunities. I think there are two questions there. One is about going to work elsewhere, and that's great, and do it and take every opportunity when it presents itself. The more fundamental question is about applying to medical school elsewhere. Now, I would be very cautious about that and make sure you understand what the registration requirements are. If you qualify in that country, what they will be to let you back into the UK, because they're not always that straightforward.
Thank you very much for coming in, and for your time. It has been really, really interesting, both
it's been a pleasure.
for medical students and also for me that I'm in medicine, and to be able to listen to your all your tips and all your on your thoughts on this has been amazing. Unfortunately, we cannot take any more questions. Is there a way that the people here may be able to contact you, possibly, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy. If they all prepare themselves and get a pen handy here, because I'm not that techie at the moment. I'd like to. Okay, my name is evident. It's Wilson DJ2. That's a numerical 2. Okay, so it's Wilson DJ, stands for David John, but it's Wilson DJ2 at cardiff.ac.uk. And if they want to email me, that's fine. I can deal with any questions and maybe direct them that way. I'd be more than happy to do that.
So I've just posted your email address. Sorry, is it DJ or DJ?
D for David. Yeah, David DJ Wilson. Yeah.
So thank you so much, and have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, not at all. No,
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.